Today in my line of Nintendo Fanboy reviews Sega Genesis games, I will be reviewing the venerable Phantasy Star 4. It released in Japan on December 17, 1993, and in the US on February 1995. Just like the three entries before it, this was both developed and published by Sega themselves. This is actually quite incredible because this is renowned as one of the greatest jRPGs ever made, which begs the question of why there wasn't a Phantasy Star 5, 6, and so on. I'll discuss the series itself as a whole a little bit later. Phantasy Star 4 is very much a jRPG of its time. It has turn-based battles akin to the Dragon Quest series, with dungeons where players loot treasure chests and ultimately fight a boss, along with a great story for its time. Where it deviates is its sci-fi setting. Now, most jRPGs were set in high fantasy settings, but Phantasy Star 4 sees the player navigate to different planets and satellites via spaceships as the story progresses. Phantasy Star itself is also known for its two online games, Phantasy Star Online 1 and 2. The first entry released in December 2000 for the Dreamcast and later for the GameCube and PC. PSO1, as it's known, is known for being the first online MMORPG released for home consoles, beating Final Fantasy XI to the punch by a year and a half. Phantasy Star Online 2 released in Japan on July 2012 for PCs and eventually other current-gen systems at the time. Funny enough, it didn't get released to the US until 8 years later on May 2020 for PC and Xbox One. This delay is nothing strange, as Dragon Quest X also is an MMORPG, released August 2012, which even to this day has yet to release in the West. While PSO2 saw a strong showing for the first few months in the US, I've read that it doesn't have many concurrent players. Perhaps this is why Sega delayed releasing this game to the West, besides the expensive translation costs and local server hosting requirements. Now, I've heard of Phantasy Star 4 by its high pedigree and reputation for some time now. My buddy Runjin Run had played this series before, as well as following YouTube content creators such as Happy Console Gamer, David Inc., and Dreamcast Guy, as they've mentioned this game as one of the strongest RPGs for its time and also as personal favorites. And these glowing reviews mirrored what I read in the jRPG guidebook by Bitmap Books. In this overall review series, I do normally compare the Genesis game that I am reviewing to what I think would be a relatively suitable counterpart on the NES and or SNES that I've played before. Now, as I mentioned earlier, battles are visually set up to how the Dragon Quest series has theirs. Enemies are faced in the front, with player characters attacking forward. A slight deviation to the Dragon Quest formula itself is that characters are visually stepping forward to perform their attacks, as well as to courteously receive their hits from the enemy. However, I'm going to be spending this section instead comparing Phantasy Star 4 to what I think is its most similar counterpart, and that is Final Fantasy IV, known as 2 in the US when it first released. While Final Fantasy IV released 2.5 years earlier on the SNES in Japan, and 4 years previous to the US release date of Phantasy Star 4, it still has quite a few striking similarities. And speaking of the US version, I feel the biggest similarity is the very poor translation job done on both games. While Final Fantasy IV was translated for the US by Japanese individuals whose second language was English, I couldn't exactly pin why the translation was just so poor for Phantasy Star 4. Examples of this poor translation come from some of the dialogue being captured poorly, such as emotion not being carried as well as in the in-game cinematics shown. Some of the Japanese-only jokes also don't translate well to the US audiences, like when the character Raja tries to joke around. This reminds me of King Kai's jokes not sounding right back when Dragon Ball Z was first dubbed. And it also sounds like many of the characters' names were mistranslated. For example, the main character Chaz should be Rudy, with his teacher Alice being Lyra. This in of itself is confusing, as it could put a connection between Alice from the first Phantasy Star game and Alice from the fourth entry. While Phantasy Star 4 has a ton of references to previous entries, this name exchange is not meant to be one of them. And finally, a lot of the translation can be pretty opaque and make it kind of hard to follow where the player needs to go, especially for the side quests. Now, story-wise, another comparison to Final Fantasy IV is the characters coming and going as the story progresses. The main protagonist, Chaz, just like Cecil from Final Fantasy IV, stays in the party the entire time. This is also the case with Rika when she arrives, as well as when Rune comes back to the party the second time. Near the end of the game, the player has 4 of the 5 character slots filled. The game then allows the player to select the 5th party member from one of the 5 characters that had been in the party before during the progress of the story. One nice thing with this is that they're at experience levels that match the player's current party, so no grinding is needed to get them to catch up. And this kind of reminds me of the Game Boy Advance and PSP versions of Final Fantasy IV, where also near the end of that game, the player can swap out characters that have been playable before. While these versions allow 4 of the 5 characters to be swapped, Final Phantasy Star 4 again only allows 1 character slot, the last one, to be switched out. And the last comparison I'll make to Final Fantasy IV, for now, is the space travel aspect, and really the total number of worlds that can be explored. Phantasy Star 4 allows space travel to 3 different worlds and, I believe, 2 satellites, as well as 1 quote-unquote air castle. The last 2 just being dungeons. Final Fantasy IV is the first game in the series that also allows space travel, and done by the ship the Lunar Whale, and technically also has 3 different worlds to explore. The Overworld, the Underworld, and the Moon. One thing that irked me about Phantasy Star 4 was the limited inventory space available. Now, only 5 pages of inventory are there for the player, with single units of healing and status curing items taking up 1 of the spots in each of these pages. Key items, such as the vehicles for overworld surface exploration, take up spots in the inventory, further limiting space to keep items. Weapons and armor also take up spots, so it's important to sell those when they are no longer needed. Though take heed not to sell a piece of equipment that has a special effect when used as an item. Now, I didn't know this was a thing until near the end of the game, as it isn't clearly stated anywhere. This inventory management reminds me of Final Fantasy II for the NES Famicom, where this exact problem took place. Regarding the gameplay, as mentioned before, the old jRPG standards are in play. Again, loot treasures from dungeons, turn-based battles akin to the Dragon Quest series, avoid running from battles to ensure characters are sufficiently strong enough to handle trash mobs and bosses, and buff the party at the start of battles against said bosses. This game suffers from some of these old jRPG tropes, such as a ridiculously high encounter rate. One thing that I liked about the game was the fact that most of the enemies were very unique. Now, I'm used to fighting goblins and slimes and other staples for this genre, and instead, quote-unquote bio-monsters such as blobs, slugs, and other weird enemies show up that I really haven't seen in other JRPGs before. I also appreciated one of the scripted battles where the player had to lose against the bad guy, as this reminded me of other scenarios in other such JRPGs. I also liked the fact that there were 2 different types of abilities. These are techniques and skills. Techniques use technique points, or TP, to cast spells that can support the party or attack and debuff the enemy. Skills don't use TP. Instead, they can be used a certain amount of times until they run out. This reminds me of the number of charges that spells can be used in Final Fantasies 1 and 3. Both of these cannot be replenished unless the player stays at an inn or finds a recharge spot in a dungeon that they appear in. It's also unfortunate that there are no save spots available in any dungeons either. This means if the player starts a dungeon, they must finish it or cast Highness to exit and recover, or just use save states if playing this on a current gen system. Only the character Raja's skill of Atarxia can recover TP, though this is the only method to recover that specific metric in the entire game, besides Inns and whatnot, of course. Those familiar with the first 3 entries of the Phantasy Star series will recognize a bunch of Easter eggs and references being made from these previous games. There are also a few fun references to other Sega Genesis games as well. One cool aspect with the game is that it allows the setup of something called macros in the options screen. These allow the player to set up any combination of commands for the characters to do when selected during the battle. This allows for an easier setup for something called combinations. Combos are essentially when 2 or more player characters select attacks or skills that cause them to act at the same time with a stronger ability greater than the sum of their parts. The problem with these is that they're unpredictable. I was unable to get them to consistently trigger when I wanted them to, and honestly, I didn't run into my first combination until I was roughly 2/3 of the way through the game. Specifically, for a combo to work, all of the characters involved must be set to act in succession, which is why deploying macros really helps here. Combo attacks won't trigger if another character not involved in the combo acts in between the 2 characters and/or an enemy acts in between the corresponding attacks. When these combos do trigger, they're usually pretty flashy moves that do great damage. And this reminded me of Final Fantasy IV After Years band system, though with the band system, when the character's combo was triggered once, it's available to be selected and used at the player's leisure. I also found the spell and technique names pretty confusing. It makes sense that res would cure characters' HP, as this sounds like shorthand for restore. But what is what? Why, it's singular ice damage to an enemy. I had to check the Phantasy Star 4 wiki a number of times for exactly what techs and skills did. And this is primarily because there's no in-game description stating what these all do and what elemental affinities they are. Controlling the characters is pretty standard fare. Control pad moves the character on the screen and also moves the icon to select options in menus or battles. The start button brings up the save and options menu, with the A and C buttons bringing up the status and B being the cancel button. Controlling characters on the map, though, honestly felt pretty slippery. For example, when facing a wall and pushing towards said wall, it causes the character to move around it. This made it annoying when trying to examine something, as it would push the character away from the object I tried to examine. NPCs in villages also move around enough where they're hard to talk to. They'll suddenly move, not be targeted, and then Alice will yell at me to quit dicking around. Sorry Alice, I'm just trying to talk to Stranger McStrangeface here. I also noticed sometimes when selecting a command, it'll select one too far in the direction I selected. I had to take advantage of the rewind feature a couple times because of that. Regarding the opaque nature of the translation I had mentioned earlier, there's a small set of side quests available at something called the Hunters Guild. While the game gives a good description of where the clients are at when taking on one of these mini quests, in some of these it can be unclear as what is needed to do. For example, when rescuing a girl from a local cult of Scientology, once she is rescued, she's bedridden due to being malnourished. She needs an item to recover, although the game doesn't state what item exactly. And I had to check a guide online to know to pick her up some Pedialyte. The item's exact name is Paralimate, to get her electrolyte levels, or whatever, they were back to normal. For the graphics and the overall look of the game, I'd honestly say the overworld settings are fairly basic. There are 3 worlds, which each have their own unique look, although it does extend to the entirety of their respective planets. The dungeons are either caves, futuristic factory-like settings, or castles. There's not much variety, and admittedly they look like better-looking NES environments. The sprites in the field tend to look pretty basic, especially for the main characters and NPCs. Fortunately, the battle environments and sprites there look great, and do a good job of matching whatever environment the player characters were in. Battle sprites for the enemies are greatly detailed and are often grotesque, matching well the biomonster theme of the game. The animations shown for the attacks are pretty basic, often 2 or 3 sprite movements to designate the attack itself. Fortunately, this is enough for basic attacks, as techs and skills have fantastic looking animations, and as mentioned before, combos look the best in this regard. By far the best looking part of the game were the anime-styled story cinematics. While I mentioned before the English translation isn't all that great, these cinematics more than make up for this. Watching these can really help convey overall emotions and aspirations for characters where the translation does fail. This really gave me the heart of the game and of many of the characters themselves. It showed, for example, Brika's gratefulness for traveling the world with Chaz and experiencing real life. It also showed Chaz's reluctance for becoming the hero and wielder of Elcidian. And finally, it had shown subtly, but surely, the relationship between Alice and Rune that was there when the player sees them meet again for the first time in the game. It really makes me wonder what a remake for this game would look like, especially if Sega put some real muscle into it. There were remakes for Phantasy Star 1 and 2 released in Japan only in the early aughts, and these had an Ys series anime stylized look to them. I think a remake for Phantasy Star 4 would look excellent if it was done in the same vein as something like Ys 8 or Ys 9. Phantasy Star 4's soundtrack was composed by Izuho Numata. She joined Sega fresh out of college in 1988 and cut her teeth on Sega Master System and Game Gear conversions of arcade titles like Psychic World and Ghouls and Ghosts. Her first Genesis title she composed was Phantasy Star 3, though funny enough, her last one for Sega was this title of Phantasy Star 4. My only gripe with the soundtrack is the fact that the songs were set back to the beginning of a track after completion of a battle, though this is standard fare for jRPGs at the time, as this also happened in Final Fantasy IV. While the first part of the game features exploration of towns and some cave-like dungeons, Numata's soundtrack travels with the player along their journey with tunes that match these set environments. It isn't until the player discovers the first technological environment that this feeling of otherworldliness pervades both the characters and the player themselves, with Numata's soundtrack adding to this with the mechanical sound and change in beats. And this sort of journey continues right through all the way to the ending of the game. I noticed the epilogue itself was oddly silent, with only a tune playing when the reunion of two key characters occurs at the end. I think perhaps this was part of Numata's artistic choice, emphasizing this reunion, while also encapsulating that while this is the end for the player, it's a continuation of these two characters' story, as later shown during the credits. Also, I didn't know it at the time, but there are a couple themes that are from the first Phantasy Star game, including the Air Castle level itself. This level, its musical theme, and the boss of this massive said level are an homage to this area from this first entry. Numata also generated the sound effects for Phantasy Star 4 as well, and this is amazing to me. It's not only the soundtrack being outstanding, but the sound effects, especially in battles, are fantastic too. Laser attacks to and from players sound like what I would imagine lasers would sound like. Explosions sound like they hit hard, and all of these effects tie in with battles and overworld presence quite nicely. Overall, I'm giving Phantasy Star 4 9.5 SNES controllers out of 10. There are issues with the game, such as the poor translation, controls feeling a bit slippery, and lack of description for text and skills. However, these could easily be fixed nowadays with quality of life updates on a singular port or even a potential remastered remake. This is the first RPG I've played on the Sega Genesis, and I worry that this probably will be the best one that I will ever play for the system. Now, this isn't to diminish the other entries in this series or perhaps other RPGs for the system. I just feel Phantasy Star 4 is on its own level, along with titles like Final Fantasy IV and Dragon Quest V for that era. The only echelon higher than this would be Super Mario RPG, Final Fantasy VI, and the perfect Chrono Trigger. After completing this game, this does beg the question of why Sega never made a remake or remaster. Now, I know I'm beating a dead horse because I've mentioned that a number of times already, but Sega knows this is one of the highest rated games on the Genesis, and they've seen Square Enix and Nihon Falcom remake several titles from their respective series. Hell, Konami just announced remakes for their games Suikoden 1 and 2. As mentioned before, they remade the first two games in this series, but again, they were only released in Japan. I'm going to assume that Sega didn't want to pay the additional costs to translate these for Western audiences, that may have noted low sales on these two games to not merit further remakes for said third and fourth entries. I'm also left with another question of why there weren't any more Phantasy Star games after this entry beyond their online presence. I've seen that this fourth entry was meant to be the end of this series of games, but Dragon Quest III was also meant to end that series of stories it was telling too. Dragon Quest then picked up on its own new world and story with Dragon Quest IV, and arguably gave some of the best RPGs in this time frame with that series' 3rd, 4th, and 5th entries. It makes me wonder how good Phantasy Star 5 and 6 could have been if Sega wanted to develop them at that time. Maybe Sega was just too busy working on the Sega Saturn. It released in Japan on November 1994 and the US May 1995, around the time of Phantasy Star 4's release on the Genesis. And it should be noted that Saturn got a collection of all 4 Phantasy Star games on February 1998, but again, Japan only. Fortunately, Sega has ported Phantasy Star 4 a number of times and is easily playable. It's one of the 42 games on the Sega Genesis Mini 1, it's on the NSO Expansion Pack service, and is on the Sega Genesis Classics collection on all current gen consoles and PC Steam. If you like classic JRPGs with a fun sci-fi twist, I absolutely recommend taking the time to play this title. Now, have you guys ever heard of Phantasy Star 4 or any other games in this series? Let me know in the comments section below. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications to alert when more content's released. Thanks for watching and have a great day.